This video is an introduction to the Victorian era, the next era of our timeline, and be sure that you're taking notes on your notes template so that you'll be ready to send those to Canvas. First, we'll talk about the years. We generally say that the Victorian era started in the 1830s, and that's because Victoria became Queen of England in 1837, but the Romantic period ends right about here at the beginning of the 1830s. And then we'd say that the Victorian era lasts until 1901, the year of Queen Victoria's death. Queen Victoria, it's important to know, lived a very frugal and prudent lifestyle. So her whole point was to expand England and take it through a time of growth, and also then to reform it. So we're going to talk a little bit about why Victorian England needed reform in the first place, and then how the literature is going to reflect some of that reform. We're going to talk about some of the reasons for reform in the Victorian era with three fears that the culture possessed. The first would be unrestricted immigration, so the idea that too many people were coming into the boundaries of England without being checked, without being vetted in any way. So there was a fear in the increased levels of crimes and just in the presence of ghetto communities in general. And then to make matters worse, there was this series of murderers by Jack the Ripper in 1888. And basically what he would do, or what they think this one person would do, is slit the throats of prostitutes and then mutilate their guts, take out their organs. And most of that happened in a Jewish ghetto in London. And so the idea was, well, if that can happen, then obviously we're having much higher levels of crime and these ghetto communities are to be feared. So by 1905, we had something called the Aliens Act of 1905, and that placed restrictions on immigration from Eastern Europe. So you'll see that the Victorian era is an effort to kind of purify Victorian society, even with this rise in immigration. The second fear is physical and moral decay, and particularly a fear of sexually transmitted diseases like syphilis. But really, it was anything that was morally corrupt or considered morally corrupt or perverse, and sexuality was a big part of that. We talked about the criminal aspect of corruption with the immigration and stories like Jack the Ripper. But we'll talk about this idea of sexual morality or sexual decay as we get into Dracula and the picture of Dorian Gray. The third fear came in towards the end of the Victorian era, and we're going to call that the, quote, new woman. And basically, that would be describing any women who were taking advantage of educational and employment opportunities that became available, or just in general breaking from some of these restraints that were imposed upon them by the male-dominated society. And that was truly something to be feared, because all of a sudden you had women who were becoming educated and asking for the right to vote and doing something that really they had never been done before, and nobody really expected them to ever want to have any more say in their society. So stemming from all these fears was the general drive for social advancement and reform. So we'll reform all of the moral decay that we see happening within our society, and then we'll advance Victorian society and advance Victorian England so that it is really a major world power. The first way they would do this is through industrialization and technological advances. So notice that both of these are very much continuing on from the Romantic period. We talked about scientific advances, and we talked about the growing middle class and the common man, and that continued into the Victorian era. And even more so, we started to define social classes. So the upper class was continuing to be very wealthy with their inherited wealth. There's a growing middle class due to industrialization, and the lower class is still certainly the working class. Second would be the reform of morality and values, as we've started talking about. So severe punishment for crimes to try to, disencourage people from actually committing crimes. Sexual repression and modesty. We're still going to see a lot of sexualized language in the literature that we're going to read, but as a way to prevent any sexually transmitted diseases or to prevent people from being too promiscuous or perverse, we're going to see a lot of requests for sexual modesty. That kind of plays into strict social rules that we would have seen, and then this concept of dignity and restraint, so valuing people who are able to restrain some of these, maybe like physical or human urges. And then finally, number 5 is a patriarchal family structure. So very stereotypical of the man, the father is the head of the household, the women are submissive to him, and the sons become the next heads of the household after the fathers. That's going to play into some of the themes that we see, and I've split it up into the early literature and the later literature. So the early literature of the Victorian era does have this drive for social advancement, and it might be financial advancement. It might be marrying above one's station or one's class and seeing how you can move up through the social ranks. And it could be educational advancement. What's really important to know is that any attempt to improve social standing had to be accompanied by that proper behavior. So everything we've talked about with restraint and being dignified and working with Victorian values, all of that is giving off kind of a snooty vibe. Like everyone wants to act really proper and really prim and proper so that they can appear like they are from the upper classes and they know how to fix it or fit in and mingle with the upper classes. The later literature is a little bit different though, because this is when you see authors who start to rebel against some of those notions and some of the stereotypical moral codes of conduct. Sometimes it's presented as satire to actually make fun of the prim and proper and dignified Victorian era. And we're going to see this, and we'll talk way more about aestheticism when we get to Oscar Wilde and when we start reading The Picture of Dorian Gray. The idea is basically art is art's sake, and if I like it and you don't, that doesn't matter. It's still art. And if I see a message in it but you don't, doesn't matter. It's still art. So we're just making art based on what we feel and not because it has to say something. Finally is the genres of the Victorian era. The novel became a big source of entertainment for British people. They would pick up a novel and read through the novel. I would say kind of similar to how movies are today. And you saw a lot of romance novels like Pride and Prejudice. And if you think about it, the upper class women were the ones staying at home. So a long novel would be a good way to keep occupied for the day. And then Gothic and supernatural, just like Frankenstein, and definitely in the same vein. And we're going to read Dracula and The Picture of Dorian Gray. And then we'll also read this poem, Ulysses, by Alfred Lord Tennyson. And those were really the two major genres of the Victorian era that you'll certainly study when you get to college as well. So that's all I've got for you. Be sure you have your notes template filled out and then submit it to Canvas. And let me know if you have any questions at all.